I got called out to Seal Cove on the coast about a year ago for duty. Small town on the coast. You know how it is. Maybe 700 people tops. That's including the ones who aren't on paper. They told me I'd have a quiet 8 months. Not much happens around there usually, besides the odd poacher or pissed up drunk who just needs to spend a night in a tank to sober up. Never any real crime. Never any murders or nothing. It's a bit of an odd spot, but nice enough. Folks are pretty friendly. Made me feel at home. Lots of old folks, old fishermen and trappers and such, and they tend to keep to themselves more often. Not a lot of young people around. I guess most of them head off to college and then they don't decide to come back. Things were going pretty good until about 2 weeks in. I walked into this station that morning. Wednesday, I think it was. And I hear Sheriff Thompson and Deputy Colby talking in the lunchroom, real hushed like something's wrong. I figured I should pop my head in and say good morning, and grab some coffee too. So I stroll on in and nod, give him a good morning, and I'm about to grab a cup of joe to head back out to the office when the sheriff tells me to sit down. You can always tell in somebody's voice when there's something truly wrong. They always stumble, like they forgot how to explain things, or that the words they use don't make sense at all anymore. I could hear it in Sheriff's voice that morning. He didn't sound right. Turns out, Sheriff Thompson's father-in-law passed away the summer before at the age of 75. And he and his wife were real pioneer-type folks. Mr. and Mrs. Dossett lived up the coast in a little inlet called Loon Harbour. They had the place all to themselves, not a single other cabin around. They were totally off the grid. No power, telephone, roads, you get the picture. Only connection they had to the outside world was their wooden outboard motor and little CV radio. Mr. Dossett was an old-school trapper, and his missus worked with him, side by side, curing and tanning hides and prepping them off to ship to the city where they'd get sold at auction. The Dossetts made their living from the land and got their supplies from Seal Cove, without ever having to step foot in the city. That was the way they liked it, a quiet, simple life. Not a lot of people do that kind of thing anymore. I have to say, I admired it. Since old Mr. Dossett's death, Mrs. Dossett started talking about spending the winter in Loon Harbour again, something that deeply concerned the sheriff's family. They tried to persuade her otherwise, that alone in the wilderness was no place for a woman at her age. In the end, though, Mrs. Dossett got her way. Her undying reasoning being, it's what he would have wanted. Sheriff got real quiet then, and said that up until Monday, his wife and Mrs. Dossett had been in touch every day, and Mrs. Thompson made sure to get every detail about how she was doing on her own. The last 2 mornings, though, Mrs. Dossett hadn't been answering her radio. It wasn't like her, Sheriff said, to just leave people hanging like that. Something was definitely wrong, either with Mrs. Dossett or her radio, and we were going to have to send a team to make sure things were all right. We'd take Colby's personal speedboat and head up to the harbor and check in on Mrs. Dossett, taking a specially prepared medical kit from Donner, the town's resident doctor. The thaw was just starting, so we'd have to take our time and watch out for ice, but it should be easy to do in a few hours so long as we all keep our eyes open. Sheriff told us the plan was to leave as soon as possible and we'd be back before dark. I thought we'd easily be back by noon, but I hadn't realized at the time what we might find at the cabin in Loon Harbour. None of us could have. By 9, we were kicking off from the pier and making our way out of Seal Cove, northeast along the shoreline. Wind was like ice in our faces, but Colby's boat had a windbreak on it which made the trip bearable. The whole way, Sheriff had an uneasy look about him, which was understandable given the thoughts that were probably going through his mind. It was his wife's mother, after all. If something bad had happened to her, hell, I wouldn't want to take that news home to Mrs. Thompson. The trip took about 40 minutes, and by the time we turned around the point into Loon Harbour, we were feeling pretty anxious to get in and out of the wind and onto land. The harbour was something else, bordered on either side by hills littered with remnants of the winter's heavy snow, and with a low valley that reached for miles inland, curving left and right and filled with old evergreen tree. It was truly a hermit's paradise. The Dossett cabin stood a short while from the water's edge, in a small clearing specked here and there by birch trees. Colby tied the boat onto the end of the dock where Mrs. Dossett had hauled up her boat for the winter. She had a winch sure, but still, not bad for a 67-year-old. Despite all the beauty of the place, something seemed off about the whole picture. The harbor was ice-free, so Why hadn't the old girl put her boat back in the water? And why wasn't there smoke coming from the chimney? Strangest of all, where was she? Now, I know Mrs. Dawson liked to keep to herself these days, and I'm sure she had to work to take care of the cabin inside or out back, but after 2 full days of no human contact, surely she would notice the racket of an outboard motor less than 100 yards from her front door. "Claire," Sheriff shouted out, "you around?" Silence. "I'm here with some of the boys to check up on ya." Still no answer. "Probably busy inside?" Colby offered. He meant to comfort the sheriff, but the shakiness in his voice gave him way. He must have had that same feeling of discomfort that I did. We started up the path, walking slow, looking around for, well, anything really. And when we got a little closer, I could tell the curtains were all closed. It looked like nobody was home. "Something ain't right, boys," Sheriff said. We knew. Up on the front porch, things got even more strange. It hadn't snowed for weeks or so, and anything lying on the ground was left over for a while, hard and crusty on the top from melting and freezing over and over. The whole front porch was layered with crusty white snow. No footprints anywhere, and I started feeling mighty apprehensive when Sheriff pointed out the front door. It was open, just a little bit. "Claire?" Sheriff called again. "We're coming inside." I tensed up, preparing myself for what we'd find inside. I'd never found a cadaver before, never seen one besides at funerals. Sheriff opened the door. In the dim light of the cabin, there was a dark shape. It was hanging in the middle of the room, swinging slightly from the breeze that we let in. At first, I took it for a blanket, for a coat, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw the familiar texture of raw meat. "Dear God," I let out. Colby swore. Sheriff ran to the porch rail and got sick over and over. The shape was a body, a woman's shape, hanging by one ankle from a rafter and spinning around, slow. Beside, on the floor, a long knife with a curved blade lay in a pool of blood. A skinning knife. The cabin was cold, so cold, colder than the air outside. There was no smell, no scent of decay, and I knew at once it was because the body was frozen. We all stepped down onto the snow-patched grass and took a breath. We couldn't have imagined this. How could anyone have imagined this? The sheer horror of that poor woman's body was unfathomable. We stood there, staring out at the water, and slowly, the reality of the situation settled itself in. This was a crime scene, a murder scene. We were police. We had a job to do. Colby and I insisted again and again that the sheriff ought to sit down, that he shouldn't get too involved because it was family we were dealing with. He would have none of it, and I think in his mind, making sure the investigation went as smoothly as possible was a sort of farewell to the old woman. So the three of us got started. There were photos to be taken, so many photos. Every surface in the cabin, from every angle. The body, the knife. We dusted for prints, took samples of hair, blood, all the usual stuff. All the while, we were collecting evidence. Mrs. Dawson kept spinning around to take us in with those lidless eyes. Before long, we cut her down and got her in the body bag. I'd like to say that we did it out of respect, but that way we didn't have to feel her eyes on us anymore. If things weren't already terrible enough, other aspects of the crime scene were starting to stand out as being peculiar. First off, the lack of footprints outside the front door meant that nobody had entered or exited the cabin for at least a week. The radio was in prime, working condition, something we'd discovered when Mrs. Thompson called in to ask if we had fixed the radio yet. We didn't respond. The cupboards were stocked nearly full, and upon closer inspection it seemed as though Mrs. Dawson hadn't touched her winter supply. In the garbage, only a few empty cans were found. It was starting to look as though the murder had occurred much earlier, at the beginning of Mrs. Dawson's trip. This was backed up by the fact that the woodpile, which was stacked against the leeward side of the cabin, had barely been diminished. Inside, a small pile of sticks sat neatly by the wood stove. Stranger still was that there was only a small amount of ash in the stove, the remnants of one, maybe two fires. From the looks of things, she had just she'd been killed just a few days after returning to Loon Harbour. Sheriff, when was it you said Lucy and her last talked? I asked wearily. Day before yesterday, he said. I heard her voice myself on the radio. Clearly things weren't adding up. We were reading the scene wrong somehow. Maybe Mrs. Dawson had extra wood and food stocked for the winter. Maybe she had gotten rid of the garbage somehow. Simple enough explanation. Only explanation, really. It was just hard to keep my mind thinking logically after seeing something so disturbing. Of course, the next thing that came to mind was the murderer. Where did they go? How did they get in the cabin and sneak off, seemingly without a trace? And how did they get there in the first place? It was frightful to think that the horror of a man who had committed this crime might be a mere 2 days' walk from here, perhaps closer. Where was he? And, more worryingly, where was the... Jesus Christ! Colby shrieked from a few feet behind me, deafening my ear. I spun around as quick as possible, nearly choking with shock as he fired 2 rounds through the glass of the living room window. The hell, Colby? I shouted, grabbing for my gun. Sheriff came running out of the bedroom, revolver at the ready. What's happening? He demanded of us. But by that point, Colby was darting out through the door. Son of a bitch! We heard him yell as he disappeared into the bright spring outside. He had seen something. He had seen them. Follow me, Porter, now, Sheriff said, and we made our way onto the porch. Colby's footsteps led away from the shore towards the Dossep's trap line, straight into the woods. Colby! Sheriff yelled, but no reply came. Then, another shot. We ran as fast as we could, Sheriff in the lead, watching the right while I brought up the rear, watching the left. We could hear Colby shouting again, swearing. He sounded far off, not quite straight ahead. We were sprinting when 2 more shots rang off to our sharp left. Colby had left the main path. In patches of dirty snow, there were footprints, spaced far apart. Another shot, and then... silence. Colby, talk to us! I shouted, praying that was him who had fired that last shot. There was no sound for a good 10 seconds, and then... Here, came a weak reply. Off to our left again this time. He had started to turn back towards the cabin, full circle when we found him. He was standing with his back to a tree, gun gripped tight in both hands, eyes wide open. The poor boy was shaking like a leaf of grass in the wind. What the hell were you thinking? Sheriff boomed at him. Colby just shuddered at the noise, looking wildly around, and ran to us. The look on his face when he got near was indescribable. I'd never seen somebody look so relieved to see me. I saw, he kept muttering over and over. He looked scared, but almost like he was embarrassed to show it. I think, was all he said. We made our walk back to the cabin, slow and cautious. Whoever it was that had been watching us was surely still nearby. We figured it best to get out as soon as possible, grab our things and take the body back to town. Those woods seemed like the worst possible place to be at that point. By 6 o'clock that evening, we were pulling back into town. Nobody said a word since we'd left Loon Harbour, and the ride seemed to go on for hours. Colby was too scared up from his encounter in the woods, and I figured it best if Sheriff avoided as much stress as possible, so I offered to steer us back to Seal Cove. The whole ways, though, I kept glancing over the shore, expecting to see somebody watching us, I guess. The funeral was held 3 days later. No casket for poor Mrs. Dossett. The family had her cremated. Poor Mrs. Thompson looked like she had all the blood drained from her body. Still, she held it together. For the kids, I suppose. Colby didn't show up for the funeral. After I offered my condolences to Sheriff and his family, he told me that nobody had seen Colby at the station since the day we got back from Loon Harbour, and I should keep an eye out for him. That night, I found myself back at my desk, sorting through photo after photo from the cabin. The woman had been dead for quite some time, likely for most of the winter. Whoever had done this to her was still nearby when we arrived at the harbor, but they couldn't have possibly spent the winter there. There was no food missing, and no sign that the place had been occupied. Nothing was adding up. I started putting the folders away when the terrible thought entered my head. What if the murderer was never outside that window? What if Deputy Colby had fooled us all? He claimed to have seen somebody outside that cabin, and certainly convinced Sheriff and I that it was true, but who else had seen it? only Colby. What if he had killed Mrs. Dawson? It would explain the condition of the cabin, his mysterious encounter, everything. Colby had a boat and would have easily taken a detour to Loon Harbour during one of his hunting trips, but why on earth would he ever do such a thing? What grudge could he possibly hold against the sheriff's poor mother-in-law, or against Sheriff Thompson himself? My mind was racing, my hands shaking. Hell, it was past midnight and I hadn't slept for more than 1 hour each night since that wretched day. I needed to head home and try to get some rest. It would be best to have a clear mind when I confronted Sheriff about this in the morning. I left the station and started walking to my rented house, but decided to stop in at the pub for a quick drink. A little something to unwind. I took a seat and ordered a double rum, just as somebody slid into the stool at my left. "How'd the funeral go?" Colby asked, clutching an empty glass and stinking of whiskey. My heart nearly stopped when I heard his voice, but I had to play dumb. Very sad," I said, taking a gulp of rum. I had to get out of there as fast as possible. "You didn't come?" "I was, busy," he slurred, tapping his empty glass. "I see. Been spending some, quality time with dear Craig here?" he said, pointing at the bartender. "How about one more, bud?" Craig filled up his glass, shaking his head but saying nothing. Clearly, Colby had been here for the last few days. I hoped it was the guilt getting to him, the sick bastard. "You haven't been at the station?" No, he muttered. "I can't be looking at those pictures. Memory's bad enough, ain't it?" "It's our job," I said through gritted teeth. How could he sit here and talk about her like that? I was disgusted with him. I turned to look him straight in the face. The son of a bitch is still out there somewhere. "Got me there, Porter," he said, staring into his whiskey. Drunk as he was, it would be so easy to cuff him then and there. "Well, you saw him with your own eyes, didn't you?" I pressed. "Her. So it was a woman you saw?" I was getting impatient. "It was... her." Colby twisted in his seat and looked me dead in the eyes. "Her, Porter." I didn't know what to make of it. He didn't look like he was guilty or grieving or lying. He looked afraid. What do you mean?" I asked. Colby drained his whiskey in one go. "Claire Dawson," he said. "I saw her face watching us through the window, or maybe I'm just crazy." With that, he got up and walked out, leaving me staring at the bottles behind the bar. "Another?" Craig asked me. "No." I'm not sure why. It must have been something in Colby's voice, but I decided to hold off on telling the sheriff about my suspicions. I'd have to chat with Donna, the doctor. I was curious to see what she'd have to say about Mr. Dawson's death. The night crept by with agonizing patience, stars sliding in and out of view behind the bank of fog that hung over the harbor. Each time I closed my eyes, I would see Mrs. Dawson's lidless gaze. The last few hours of darkness I spent at the kitchen table, staring at the front door with a hand on my revolver. The clinic was quiet that morning, and when I first spoke to Donna, I could tell she was looking at me in a peculiar sort of way. She offered my cup of coffee, which I gladly accepted. I must have looked like shit. "A few questions for you about Mr. Dawson," I said. The coffee seemed to warm me straight away when I took a sip. "About his health before his death." "Right," she said. "Where would you like me to start?" Sheriff Thompson told me about his decline in health during his last year. Said that his father-in-law was unable to stay at the cabin like they had been doing all along. What sort of problems was he having? Sheriff mentioned arthritis or something like that. Donna took a sip of coffee with a puzzled look on his face. Mr. Dawson had been having joint trouble for some years before his death. I had told him that he should start easing off, retire. He'd have none of it. I gave him information about other, less strenuous activities he might try to keep active, which he dismissed as yoga for hippies. I wouldn't blame his arthritis for slowing him down so much as his more general well-being. In what way? Well, mentally, more or less. He suddenly seemed paranoid of those around him. He seemed to think that he was being watched. Interesting. It was cold in the office. Can you remember when exactly this behavior started? I could find the folder with my notes from Mr. Dawson's appointment. You have notes? Scribblings, more like. I'm not a psychiatrist officer, but I know enough to tell when somebody's mind is in a troubled state. And this was about 6 months before his disappearance. His disappearance? Apparently Sheriff had left that out. He'd never mentioned anything about any missing persons case. You didn't know? Donna took a deep breath. That poor family has been through so much. Lucy was depressed for a long time. Sheriff Thompson took her into the city for therapy for months, I remember. Mr. Dawson just got up one morning, went out for a walk, and never came home. It was a sad time for the whole town. I can imagine. There was a search, yes. Did they ever find the body? She shook her head. No body. They couldn't even give the man a proper burial. Donna gave me a look. The sheriff would know a lot more about this case than I do, officer. Have you spoken to him? Not about this. Not now. I don't want to give him or his family any more grief. Sorry to bother you, Donna, but I've just got a few more questions. Sure. You said that Mr. Dawson's behavior changed quickly about 6 months before he went missing. Given your medical knowledge, what do you think could have led to this change? Well, there are many possibilities, too many to guess. Again, I'm not a psychiatrist, Officer Porter, but it seemed to me that his personality changed due to some sort of experience, not a medical issue, some trauma that he alone had gone through. Whatever it was that he saw or imagined, I can't say, but it certainly left him unhinged, broken. Donna looked very sad. I'd never seen somebody so full of fear. Claire used to come with him to his appointments. He seemed afraid of being alone, even for a moment. But the day he went missing, Mr. Dawson left home alone. It seemed very strange. Yes. Thank you, Doctor. This has been very helpful. I got off to leave. I'm glad to help, officer. I admit, I was expecting you to ask me about Lucy's mother, not her father. Have you found some sort of connection between them? Yes, I thought, but instead I said, I'd rather not say right now. Of course, said Donna. Then she walked me out. It was still early, too early for lunch. I wasn't hungry anyways. I headed to the station to find a folder on my desk. Sheriff's office door was shut, and I didn't want to bother him. I opened the folder. The coroner's report was on top. I flipped through the pages, but most of it was just old news. Time of death was undetermined, but certainly more than a month ago. Notes about stomach contents, minor cuts, and defense wounds. I pored over it, obsessing over every line, but the one thing that grabbed my attention was the cause of death, hyperthermia, and the side note that read, minimal blood loss, no cutting of major arteries. She had actually survived being skinned alive. God, the thought of it was enough to drive somebody over the edge. Lucy would probably be needing some more therapy after all that had happened. Lucy, I thought. She was one aspect of the murder that complicated everything else. All of the evidence, all of the details about the crime scene, they all were shifted into the unreal by Lucy saying she'd been given contact with her mother throughout the winter. It was her testimony that made the whole thing so damn complicated. So, what if it wasn't true? The sheriff's wife had a history of mental distress, I knew now. Extended periods of depression. She was obviously worried about her mother's well-being and under a large amount of stress. Hell, being married to a police officer was probably stress enough. What if her conversations hadn't really happened? What if it was just a delusion of hers? But no, I realized, that wasn't it. Sheriff had told me the day at Loon Harbour that he had heard Mrs. Dawson's voice over the radio himself. Another explanation shot down. Another reason to feel very much at unease. There was only one logical next step. I'd have to talk to her myself. If anyone would know an important detail about Mrs. Dawson's situation, surely it would be her own daughter. The woman hadn't spoken to her with every day, she claimed. She must have noticed something, some small detail that would explain everything. Sheriff wouldn't be happy, but damn it, I had to do something. Sheriff's office light was on. It would have to be now, before he got home. I could use a walk anyways. I grabbed my jacket and walked out into the street. I was shocked to see the night had just begun to fall. Christ! I had been so wrapped up in things that the hours had melted away. I suddenly realized the churning hunger in my stomach and the tired ache in my eyes, but it would have to wait until later. The Thompson house was located on a new side road that hadn't been paved yet. Theirs was one of the first houses built in that area, and it was a short walk through the woods to get there. It was cold out, so I zipped up and walked fast. The hard-packed gravel crunched lightly under my feet, echoing off the bare tree trunks that carried on out of sight to either end of the road. But was that an echo? It didn't quite sound like an echo. The footsteps sounded faster than my own. I stopped, and they got faster and louder. I spun around, reaching for my revolver, and realizing too late that I left it at my own desk at the station. The figure flew at me from the shadows and rammed straight into my chest. It knocked the breath out of me, and as I struggled to get it off me, the stench of sweat and whiskey filled my nose. Colby's face was mere inches from my own, his bloodshot eyes staring into mine and darting wildly off to one side or the other, scanning in the woods, before looking back at me. Tears were wet on his cheeks, and spit flew in my face as he screamed, "Stop it! Stop it! You have to help me! Have to stop it! Please! Make her go! Make her go! Let me go!" I yelled back, struggling to free my hands, but he had me pinned them to the ground. "Get off me now!" I saw it, and it wants me, Porter. She's going to kill me. Porter, please! Fuck, Colby, snap out of it, I yelled, but he was beyond reason. There was madness in his eyes. You saw her too. Oh God, you were right there. You had to. She's coming, Porter. Help me. Please make her. I managed to free my hand and slammed a fist into the side of Colby's head. He rolled off, screaming, swearing, and crying. What in God's name? I didn't get to finish the sentence before he lunged at me again. I barely got to my feet, but in his crazed, drunken state, I managed to get out of the way. I just grabbed for my handcuffs when he pulled the gun on me. No! He screamed, scrambling to his feet. Don't do this to me! Colby. My throat was dry. Colby, let's talk about this. No! He was sobbing now. The hand holding the gun was shaking. He was pointing at me, but his eyes kept darting off to the trees. No, please! There was a loud crack, like the breaking of a branch, off to one side, and he swung the gun around, firing 3 shots into the woods. This was my chance. I slammed a boot into the back of Colby's leg as hard as I could. He went down like a wounded animal, screaming and shaking. Gunshots were ringing out as he fired wildly around. I ran faster than I'd ever ran before. I scrambled over the gravel road, nearly falling head over heels while Colby's screams and gunshots filled the night among other stranger sounds. My memory is fuzzy after that. Bits and pieces are all that remain. I know I got to the Thompson house. I remember the look of shock on Lucy and the kids' faces when I stormed in, slamming the door behind me. I remember the sheriff arriving and an ambulance showing up. Colby was nowhere to be seen. All that remained on the road was a handful of empty bullet casings and some blood. I remember handing over my badge and leaving my house key in the landlord's mailbox, along with a short letter saying I was moving out. My last memory of Seal Cove is the bus ride back to the city. 4 hours of dead radio and nothing to look at but trees. I looked at the floor instead. I got a new job, new apartment, and tried never to think about it again. Until now. News Station Tonight aired a story on the growing number of missing persons in rural towns. The count now stands at 11, 9 being residents of Seal Cove, including the town's deputy sheriff. They showed a quick clip of Sheriff Thompson, who looked more gaunt than ever. Only 3 bodies had been found, exhibiting what the reporter referred to as heavy mutilation. It doesn't take much imagination to figure out exactly what that means. People have to know it's not safe anymore. That thing, whatever it is, it's gotten bolder. It had to have started with Mr. Dossett. He had awoken it at Loon Harbour, it seems. After that, it had lured him off somewhere, made him follow it into the trees. Then it descended on his wife when she was alone and miles away from help, probably in Mr. Dossett's form. And Colby. Poor innocent Colby. The thing had followed us back to Seal Cove in pursuit of him after he'd seen it at Loon Harbour. We had lured it straight to humanity. How many of these new cases of victims of the same evil? Is this all our fault? God, I don't know if it will leave the woods long enough to come and enter the city, but how will we know when it does? Each stranger you pass in the street could be it in disguise. Each voice you hear on the phone could be a lie. The only safety, it seems, is to never be alone. Mr. and Mrs. Dossett, Colby, they had all been alone when it came for them. Maybe if I hadn't abandoned Colby in the road that night, he'd still have survived. Tomorrow I board the bus and head back to Seal Cove for questioning by the sheriff. Being the last person to see Colby alive, I always knew it was just a matter of time. God knows if I'll ever make it back, or if that thing takes me out and makes a new mask of my face. This Skinner, I've come to call it. It haunts my dream every night, and though I've never seen it with my own eyes, it's in my dreams. It's always Colby, though always watching silently from behind the trees. It won't stop. It's on the move and picking up speed. I wish I could say I know more about what to do, but I don't. For now, all I can say is stay close, stay safe, and stay out of the woods.